This is a masterclass on the challenge of retrofitting historic buildings. This is a RISE event which is fully funded by the Department of Energy, Security, Net Zero, and is delivered by Turner and Townsend. Thank you again for joining. I'll hand over to Sophie Norton to start today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Toju. So yeah, you're all very welcome. I've already said that I have a bit of a background in the heritage sector. I worked in local authority for a little while, and then at the University of York and latterly at Historic England. And over that time, I sort of developed quite a lot of interest in heritage skills, so the skills that you need to work on historic buildings. And that's how I got very interested in retrofit, because the skills are in some ways very different, but in some ways lots of the issues are the same. And then I have some experience of delivering retrofit measures to pre-1919 buildings on a small area-based scheme that I managed in South Manchester for a couple of years. So now I'm here and really happy to always talk about this subject, because I said I think it's an interesting one where there's lots of evidence about change. So we'll start off, that's the introduction. Then we'll go on to look at traditional buildings and heritage planning, because while the two things are similar, they are definitely distinct, and they might, whether your building is traditional or protected, might influence the way that you deal with it. Then we'll look at the different heritage asset types. We've already had a few listed here. And then we'll think about local decision making, managing risk, and then those case studies at the end. And we'll end on some resources, but there are links throughout the presentation, so I kind of encourage you to look around at them when you get the slides. So there's just a list of key terms which hopefully will be useful to you. You'll hear about all of these in the presentation. So the NPPF, Local Planning Authority, and Local Plan. But I think rather than describe them all now one by one, what I'll do is just reflect on them as we use them in the presentation. But they're here for you as a reference point for future. So traditional buildings and heritage planning. So traditional buildings are usually defined as those built before 1919. And what's important about those, what characterises them from ones that were built later generally, is that they're built with solid walls. And having solid walls and trying to improve them thermally by putting insulation on them carries some risk. So those of you that work in sustainability and retrofit and have done will be very aware of this risk. And we know that trying to change the performance of our buildings carries risk in lots of ways. But some of the biggest retrofit deteriorations, I think is the sort of technical term, we've seen have happened on pre-1919 buildings. I think everybody is kind of acutely aware of the challenges around what happened in Fishwick in Preston, and that is why we tend to think about pre-1919 buildings as being different when it comes to making energy improvements. Heritage buildings are slightly different. So I would argue that heritage buildings are, they're ones that have some kind of planning constraint. So they don't necessarily have to be built before 1919. And a lot of you that are working with conservation areas probably have buildings that are in those conservation areas that were not built before 1919, and so probably are not classed as a pre-1919 building. And we also have listed buildings that are not pre-1919. So the vast majority of listed buildings are, but some of them, and it's unusual to get a listed building that's younger than 30 years old listed, but a few are, and this example here is just the Lloyd's of London building that was, when it was listed, it was the youngest building ever to be listed. So the distinction is important because we need to be careful with all traditional buildings, and we need to be mindful of the fact that where heritage constraints exist, we're kind of working within the framework that means, but they're not always one and the same. So all of those types of buildings do have kind of peculiarities when it comes to taking energy efficiency measures. So moving on, and then this is the key heritage planning framework. So at the top level, we have legislation, and that is set by government. And then we have policy, which is known as the National Planning Policy Framework. And again, that is set by government and is updated quite regularly. and a lot of people here will be familiar with the MPPF, will have worked within the MPPF, and they will know that it's sort of presented in thematic chapters. And the one on heritage and conservation is advised on by Historic England, so they're quite involved in the writing of the MPPF. And then underneath that, we have the planning practice guidance, which they're not used massively in the heritage sector, I'm going to say, but they are quite useful, I think, when it comes to working in AOMBs. And then at the bottom level, we also have the Historic England advice notes that Historic England publishes, and so they can be seen as formal guidance. There's something missing here, though. Does anybody want to have a stab at what tier of decision making and a policy is not listed here? So I think it's the local authority. So obviously thank you, Paul. Each local authority has a planning department, and it's their job to take all of this policy context that's written at a national level and make sure that it is as locally specific as it can be without kind of watering down what's required at that national level. So yeah, the local authority are really important in this context, and we will go on to see why. But before we do that, we'll just have a look at the specific pieces of legislation that exist. So I think the context for all of this really is the General Permitted Development Order. And again, those of you working in planning and with kind of buildings more generally will be very aware of the General Permitted Development Order, the GDPO, because that is the piece of legislation that gives people permission to do certain things on their homes. And we have seen quite a lot of it in the news in the last few years because there have been some tweaks to it. And one of them was very recent, and it withdrew the need for permission to install a heat pump within 1 metre of a property boundary. So does previously you had to get permission to get planning permission to install a heat pump for if it's within 1 metre of your property boundary. Now, because they have amended the General Permitted Development Order, that is automatically given permission. So your starting point is that nothing is permitted ever, but then we have this General Permitted Development Order that applies to most houses, doesn't always apply to flats, that applies to most houses, which means that you have permitted development to do certain things, and that gives you control over things like your windows and your roof covering. Now you can install your heat pump where you want it. If you live in a detached house, you can install 2. So that's really the starting point, that you don't, without that law, you don't have a right to do that. And so the pieces of legislation listed underneath, they remove those permitted development rights for specific reasons. So the Ancient Monument and Archaeological Areas Act, it establishes that national government and establishes that these things can exist, ancient monuments can exist. There has to be a list of them. And when something is on the list, permit development rights no longer apply. The Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act does the same thing. It establishes that lists of these things exist, and that then you will need permission. Then the GDPO does not apply. And the Historic Buildings and Ancient Monuments Act does something similar with some different types of asset. And then the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act is different again, because it gives the capacity for local authorities and others to give back permission in a blanket way. So we'll go on to talk about that in a little bit. So policy, we talked about legislation, now we're looking at policy, which was the second in that tier of 5. There was 4 illustrated, the 5th one was local planning. So like with all planning considerations in England, the framework is the MPPF. So it's published by MHCLG, but as I've already said, it's advised on by Historic England, which is sponsored by the DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And so there is a bit of a disparity there. There's 2 kind of government departments that are involved in different types of things, both filtering into this one document, which broadly speaking, it aims to achieve housing supply, economic growth and sustainable transport, while at the same time protecting heritage, the natural environment and climate change mitigation. So those two things can be seen, those two groups of things can be seen as sort of opposed in some ways. One is very much about growth, the other one is very much about sustainability. And it's for local authorities to take that context and make sure that it can be applied in a way that is locally relevant and best for your local area. And that is why quite often you might find that you get what feels like a different decision in one place to another. So a lot of housing associations out there now are managing housing stock in different local authority areas, and they might feel that some of the decisions that are made on planning permission applications for planning permission are very kind of dissimilar, and how can that be fair? But actually what that generally illustrates, I think, is that local authorities are making this decision of this balancing act, doing this balancing act in a way that favours the things that's already good about that area. So when I was a conservation officer, I used to work in a very north part of Cheshire, which is quite industrial. It has a town in it called Ellesmere Port, which has a lot of oil refineries and stuff in it, or did have, and it's really close to Chester. And in Chester, a huge amount of the economy is about tourism and people visiting to enjoy its heritage. And you would find that decisions in Chester might be like favour conservation of heritage over and above other things, where in Ellesmere Port, conservation of heritage might be seen as less important than growth. So you can get that disparity in areas that means decisions are taken differently by different people, and it can be frustrating, but it is fact. So the NPPF as well, I think it's important to note in this area, which is, as we've said, is an area of great change, how we make decisions about energy efficiency in historic buildings. The NPPF, when it was first published in 2012, it replaced something called the Planning Policy Guidance, which was published in 1990, and that might seem like an archaic thing to sort of refer to here, but the PPG 15 was incredibly specific. So it said things. It was all about how to conserve heritage assets. Didn't use that terminology, but that's what it was. But it was very specific. So it would say things like the repointing of a listed building always needs listed building consent. And when kind of that level of specificity has been kind of replaced now by something which is kind of a bit more general, but allows us to take. So yeah, the PPG 15 was very specific, and it said, the exact types of materials or the exact elements of a building that would need to be conserved. And we've kind of moved away from that now. And what we try to do is think more broadly about what makes a building important or a place important, and what is significant about it. And you see this term significance used an awful lot. And if you're in conversation with conservation officers or kind of heritage specialists, they will be talking about significance a lot of the time, or they should be. And so it can be. It sort of means that the parameters are less clear, I suppose. They've gone from this place where things are very specific to a place where it's a bit more broad, but with this is quite a lot of opportunity. So in the past, conservation of character and appearance was always about the fabric of a building. So it was always about the mortar between the joints and the windows and how they were built and stuff. And now we can think a bit more broadly about what is it that place means to a community. And it's quite useful here, because where you have certain types of buildings like almshouses, or we came across a building that has a specific mixed use covenant, and has had for about 100 years, you can argue that forms part of those buildings' significance. And that means that you can argue that you need to take these changes, make these energy efficiency measure changes, in order to keep them in the use in which they were originally intended, because that use is part of their significance. So there is an opportunity there, and we'll kind of come back to how you will do that, how you can do that in conversation with the planning department. And then there's a whole range of Historic England advice notes that are there to help, very much as sort of reference points. So useful ones for you guys might be one on conservation areas. Then things about making changes to heritage assets. And then a bit more usefully probably is how to write heritage statements of heritage significance, what getting listed building consent means, how it looks. And then finally, one that was published last year was adapting historic buildings for energy efficiency and carbon efficiency. And if you look at that, you'll see that while there are statements in there like you will need listed building consent for X, or you will be unlikely to get listed building consent for X, it never says you won't get listed building consent for X, because the decision very much stands with the local authority. Historic England can offer advice, but the decision on it is with the local authority. And we'll talk about those different layers of decisions, who's involved in those decisions, but on an asset by asset basis in a second. I think that is the risk, Paul, and one of the big kind of themes that undergoes all of this is risk, because like what we said at the very beginning, there is this risk associated with any change to historic buildings, that they are a finite resource, and we do kind of risk if we lose something, it's gone forever, it can't be replaced. But I think more than that, people are now worried about what the future impact of some of the measures might have on these buildings. So there's a few more. So some of these are about being able to get blanket permission for listed for some of these changes. So I said about the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act that enables LLBCOs, local listed building consent orders, and we'll look at one of those in a second. And one of the acts I didn't mention actually is the Localism Act, which I think was 2000. I think it was 2012, but I think maybe it was later. But that gave provision for the development of neighbourhood plans. And one of the best case studies, most innovative case studies I've found of making change in these areas comes from York's neighbourhood plan, which we'll kind of talk about in a second. So heritage asset types. These are, broadly speaking, these are the 6 that exist that cover above ground heritage assets. So we have scheduled monuments, listed buildings, conservation areas, locally listed buildings, parks and gardens, and World Heritage Sites. I've put a picture of one of my favourite places, which is Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire. And I know that doesn't have much to do with retrofit, but the point here really is that we protect heritage assets for the public benefit. So until 1877, there was no such thing as listed building consent. There was no such thing as a listed building. Landowners were free to demolish and replace things at will. And actually, when this legislation was brought in, it was quite it was a very difficult thing to get through Parliament, because landowners were, understandably really kind of like really worried about not being able to do what they want with their own land. But yeah, so it didn't come about until the late 19th century. But we very much do it now because of the public benefit. And when it first started, there was only a very, very small number of things that were actually on the schedule of ancient monuments, and mostly it was Roman remains and castles, and gradually we started to protect more and more and more, and that is generally because we understand that it's a big contributor to place, and we do it for the public benefit. So that is kind of the undercurrent of why we do all this, when it can be seen as much easier, much cheaper sometimes to start again. So this is the first one of the big group, is scheduled ancient monuments. A lot of these are underground, so completely irrelevant here, but there are some of them that are not, they're above ground. They're really, really, really highly protected, and I hope that nobody here is working with a scheduled monument. But they're designated for fact's sake, they're designated by the DCMS on the advice of Historic England. The consent process is actually managed by Historic England, which is really unusual. And if you are working with an asset that's listed and scheduled, then the scheduling overrides listed building consent, and you shouldn't need to get both permissions. And in the local authority I worked in, we didn't know that. We had a scheduled monument that was being converted into housing, and we asked for listed building consent. So here are the listed buildings. I think that everybody here will be familiar with these. Lots and lots of our kind of landmark historic buildings are listed. So the image on the left is Wells Cathedral, and then on the next left, the the big factory is a 1930s chocolate factory in York. And the reason I've included that, it was because it was converted into a sort of mixed use development with housing not that long ago. And then the building on the right is building in South London, and you'll see that it's a terrace of about 6 properties, and they're all covered by one listing. So we don't actually know how many buildings in the country are covered by listing, or how many properties are covered by conservation areas. That's a sort of unknown quantity. But what we do know is there's a huge amount of overlap in some of this stuff, like in the chocolate works. The second left, that building is in a conservation area, and a couple of them are listed. So we know there's a lot of overlap, but we also know there are listings like the one on the third right, which covers several properties. So it's a fairly unknown quantity, but what we do know is that listed buildings are designated by Historic England, but that the consent system is always managed by the local authority. And Historic England is a statutory consultee, but only on grade 1 and grade 2 star listed buildings, and that most buildings, about 94% of buildings, are just grade 2. So Historic England is only statutorily has to advise on a very small proportion of those. Do you have to get consent if you are changing the internal door keypad lock with a fob of a listed building? So the answer there is always if it affects significance. So I'll go on to tell you how that to talk about how that decision would be made in a local context, and how you can give yourself the best possible chance of being able to get permission, if it's argued that you need permission. It would depend. Again, it always depends. So hang on a sec. So these are conservation area. Where are listed buildings? Okay. So it says the whole listing applies to the whole building. So that includes curtilage. A lot of people don't know that. So if you have a house with a coach house that's not attached but separate, the local authority can determine that whole thing is curtilage. That again, that's down to the local authority to make that judgment, not Historic England. And it also covers fixtures and fittings. And there has been case law where they found that paintings that were designed as part of a interior and the building was listed had to stay as part of the listed building because they contributed to significance. So it really depends on whether or not the thing that you need to change contributes to significance. So if you have a grade 2 listed building with restricted alterations on its windows, does the restriction apply to the whole building? So yes, the listing applies to the whole building, and if the windows are significant, then they can't make alterations. Then you have to think, what would the heating measure, what would the impact of that be on the building? Would you have to replace all the radiators? Would you have to replace all the pipe work? Are you thinking about putting in a heat pump outside? So it's really about understanding what is significant about that building, understanding in detail the change that you're suggesting, and then making an assessment as to how that change affects the significance. It's sort of that 3-step process. And that's why it's always advisable to get pre-application advice. It's always advisable to talk to the local authority at an early stage. So conservation areas, these are designated by local authorities. So Historic England aren't involved in designating conservation areas, and generally they're managed through planning permission as a material consideration. And I have seen the General Permitted Development Order says that you do need planning permission if you are changing, I can't remember the terminology now, but changing the appearance of the building. And so you can apply that in this context. So if you're saying I'm going to put it into external wall insulation on this building and it's going to look different, then the local authority can ask for planning permission. But equally, they can apply for that outside of conservation areas as well, because it's just in the GPDO, sorry. And I've seen that happen as well. In fact, the projects that I worked on in South Manchester, they were on terraced houses, a bit more detailed than the ones in the pictures, but they weren't affected by any conservation or planning constraint, and we had to get planning permission for the EWI. And then the other considerations that we said that they can permissive development rights can also be withdrawn with Article 4 directions. So the point that you've just made there about windows, that can apply in conservation areas if the local authority has used an Article 4 direction to remove permitted development rights for that, and they can do that on windows and doors and anything external really they can use to protect roof coverings as well, but you cannot apply that internally. So it's only listed buildings and scheduled monuments where inside is protected as well, can be protected if it's significant. So then locally listed buildings, they're designated by local authorities. Again, they're managed through planning permission, like a material consideration, much like conservation areas, and they can also withdraw permitted development rights within Article 4. I haven't come across many locally listed buildings in conversations like this yet. And then registered parks and gardens, I think they're quite few and far between at the moment, but they do have physical assets in them. Sometimes they're listed, and the legislation applies to them in the same way. So they're managed through planning permission as a material consideration, but you can use an Article 4 to remove permit development rights. And World Heritage sites are exactly the same. So it's a bit surprising because obviously we think of them as the very top level of heritage protection, but they're designated by UNESCO, so it's an international list, and they are managed through planning permission, much like conservation area and locally listed buildings. And that is just a summary of the differences for your kind of reference going forward. So local decision making, local authorities should adopt a local plan, and in that little local plan you'll get a feel for how important conservation of heritage assets is. There should be policies on conservation as well as other subjects, so you will be able to start to unpick how important the local authority thinks that is. And I think at this point, if you do realise that your building is a heritage asset, you should engage in that pre-application discussion, because the reality is that most listed building consent applications are approved. Most applicants go into positive discussion with the local authority and they come out of it positively. I think what the challenge here is going to be cost and timescales. But you know, statistically, most listed building consent applications are approved, and we're got some case studies of that coming up. And then that point on pre-application. Now I've included this picture here because the MPPF asks local authorities to ask applicants to set out what they think is significant about their heritage asset in a heritage statement. Now, a lot of applicants find that burdensome. You know, you just said, well, can I get listed building consent for this? And the answer is always going to be, is it going to impact the building's significance? But actually, there is a framework for analysing and making an assessment of what is significant about that building. And you hold, the MPPF asks local authorities to ask you to do that. So while it can be seen as a burden, it's also quite a powerful tool. So you might be able to think about your buildings and think about those uses and how long they might have been almshouses for, and what the reality is if you can't install these energy efficiency measures right now, and you can include that in a heritage assessment, which will help you make the argument that yes, your building is significant, but you are affecting significance, but that it's beneficial for another way, because you will be able to retain it in its current use, and that will enhance its significance over the next 20 or 30 years. The other thing that's really important to make, a point to make, is that when local authorities are making these decisions, the only situation in which they are allowed to permit harm to the significance of a listed building is if it's outweighed by the public benefit. And what people are finding now is that conservation officers are really good at making assessments about how harm will affect the significance of a building, but there isn't so much information about how you make the assessment on public benefit. So what we've seen through kind of lots of a few case laws now. So where not case law, but where Historic England has consulted on planning applications or listed building consent applications that install energy efficiency measures that do cause harm to significance, and the local authority argues that it is outweighed by the public benefit, Historic England has generally said the assessment of harm versus public benefit is for the local authority to make. So that's the other thing that's really important when you're talking to your local authority, is that in lots of consultation responses now, it's Historic England is saying, well, it's the local authority who has the best understanding of how important that benefit is to the public locally. And again, I'll show you some case studies where you can go for that information in a bit. But that is local decision making. And then this slide is more about local measures that can be put in place to ease decision making, I suppose. So the main one of these is led by the local authority, which can be difficult if the local authority is really nervous about these sorts of changes. But there are examples now of local listed building consent orders that give blanket permission for certain buildings to install energy efficiency measures across groups of buildings. And so the main one of those is Kensington and Chelsea, where they permitted solar panels on the roofs of certain buildings, on certain roofs on certain buildings, on I think they were just grade 2 listed buildings within that local authority area, and I think they've gone on to do one on windows as well. And they're quite detailed, and they're written in a very detailed way, so they only give permission for very specific things, and it does involve quite a lot of upfront work. But yeah, that measure does exist. And then there's also something called a heritage protection agreement, which we've seen less often in this context, I'm going to say, but where organisations own a swathe of buildings, they can do a similar thing. They can work with the local authority to establish a heritage partnership agreement so that they have permission to do kind of ongoing repairs, replacements of the buildings across their estate. So a heritage statement required for all listed buildings for retrofit purposes. So a heritage statement is required so that when you are applying to make change in a historic environment and you need permission, the NPPF says that the local authority should ask you to set out what is significant in a heritage statement, and that could happen in a number of different contexts. So if I would expect it would usually happen in the context of a listed building consent. So you've got a listed building and you want to put PV on the front elevation, the local authority, they would kind of go away. They might say, you're unlikely to get permission for this, but if you want to pursue it, you need to write a heritage statement that sets out why your building is significant, and then provide detail about what you want to do. And then they will be able to make the assessment about whether or not what you want to do has an impact on the significance that you've set out. For unlisted buildings in conservation areas, I think they would be more loosely applied. And I think you'd be unlikely to be asked for a heritage statement on an unlisted building in a conservation area, but I don't think you can rule it out completely. So if it's a conservation area building with an Article 4 direction that says these windows shouldn't be replaced, then you would need to get planning permission to replace the windows, and then you might be asked to write the heritage statement. So yeah, there are circumstances in which you might be asked for a heritage statement, but it's nothing to be frightened of. So it is a piece of admin, it is a piece of work that has to be done, but it does give you the kind of power to set out what is significant about that building, and quite broadly. So contractors, not so much, Marie. In past 2035, there's quite a lot of requirement around the retrofit coordinator and some of the other roles, the retrofit assessor, but that level of detail doesn't pass down to past 2030, unfortunately. And there are a few qualifications around for contractors in heritage skills, but the building world is quite an unregulated world, really, outside of the past 2035 context. And you would find it difficult to find installers and contractors that have specific qualifications in heritage and listed buildings. So yeah, on the conservation officers themselves, it's kind of a pause to see who they are. We've already talked about that conservation officers are really well versed in how to assess significance, but not necessarily so well practiced, I guess, at assessing public benefit. And that can be difficult. And I think that broadly speaking, the profession and Historic England is quite aware of the challenges in this particular context. So stepping outside of that a little bit, they're often the only heritage specialist in a planning department. That can be quite isolating. That was certainly my very first experience of being a local authority. And research shows that while demand for their skills is growing, availability has fallen since 2006. So the numbers of conservation officers around the country sort of fell off a cliff in 2006. And then 59% of local authorities say they've had inquiries about retrofit and historic building adaptation rising all the time. And Historic England has found that confidence around decision making is mixed. So it's an area of change. It's also an area that's really quite under-resourced. And so it can be difficult for everybody to sort of be at the same level when they're working in that isolated context. So just bear a thought around that. And again, that's an opportunity for you because you know really well all of the stuff that's in place to prevent risk in retrofits, which is really what local authority conservation officers are worried about. You know, we've already said that historic buildings are a finite resource. If we make changes to them that damage them in any way, we've lost that resource forever. And for a long time, the way to conserve the historic environment has been about being like for like. So I think Paul used the term like for like, and that term is embedded in the 1990 PPG 15 that I talked about earlier. It's like for like this, like for like that. This won't need listed building consent if you replace it in a like for like way. And now we've kind of moved on quite a lot from that, but it was so specific and prescriptive that we've gone to a much more a broader place, and it can be more challenging to sort of navigate. But the information that they need, broadly speaking, is the heritage statement that sets out the significance. And we have got a toolkit with like a little template that might help you do that and provide some ideas about resources that you can go to look at. So most counties have a historic environment record where there's loads of cool stuff about what, how the local areas have developed. And there's obviously Historic England's list, which also contains some useful stuff. So yeah, there's a little template there about how to articulate significance. Then they want clear and detailed information on the implementation of specific energy efficiency measures, because while this is this is all very broad and policy, and the language around it is kind of navigable in policy terms, really when something physical is identified as significant, his conservation officers want to know as much detail as possible about what the change is going to be. And that's a really difficult thing to communicate often. It involves lots of technical drawings, and technical drawings that are then installed perfectly on site. And we all know how challenging that can be. So they want a lot of detail around the exact thing that you're going to do, so they then can make that assessment about whether it will harm significance and if the public benefit will outweigh that. And they also want to know evidence about carbon savings. So there's an awful lot of literature now about embodied carbon, but it's really difficult to make an assessment about, how long it will take to pay back the embodied carbon in a new piece of insulation. We know, broadly speaking, that to conserve a building is better in energy terms than to build a new one. But beyond that, we don't have any idea how much more carbon is used in running a historic building that isn't retrofit as compared to an exactly the same historic building that is retrofit. I think the AEBC, the Association for Environmentally Conscious Buildings, estimate that it's about 7 years to pay back the price of the carbon price of EWI. But that's not it's a very much a developing area, I would say, and that's the kind of thing that conservation areas want to know about. Conservation officers want to know about is like, what is the carbon advantage of this? And there are some research projects going on that kind of looking at that and exploring it further. And then, fundamentally, they want their concerns about risk alleviated. So we've seen projects like Preston. We know from working in historic buildings for a long time that using modern materials on them has gone really wrong in lots of cases. Even at Fountains Abbey, there's examples of cement that was put in the post-war period that have created really bad damage for some of the stonework there. So we've known that through observation of trying to conserve buildings for 150 years. So now to then say, and that's why there is so much language around like for like in conservation. So now to say, well, actually, we need to improve the performance of these buildings, and to do that, we are going to have to use modern materials and methods, is a bit scary, and it's a big sea change in conservation. And so we do have to be very sensitive about how we talk about it. But we do have an amazing framework for it now. So you might find in talking to the planning department that their conservation officers might know about the whole house approach. They might not necessarily know about the framework around how we achieve that and how we manage the risk from, delivering essentially retrofit on these solid wall buildings often. They will know about building regulations, but for a long time, listed buildings have been, they can be treated quite gently in building regulations. There's usually a specific clause that says if it's going to harm the significance of this building, then it doesn't have to go in. And then I think the British standards are something that kind of aren't well used enough, I would say, outside, in householder conservation. But then at the very top level, I think we have past 2035, which again, conservation officers might not be well versed in it. But I think in the detail, in the risk matrix, the risk matrix is kind of very much backs up what the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Association have said with their wheel. So yeah, there's quite a lot that's come out of historic buildings research that has fed into past 2035, and now that framework exists to try and avoid the risks that conservation officers are worried about, and that does filter down all the way to qualifications. So if you look back, I think it's in Annex 6 or something like that, but if you look at the back, it does set out which qualifications are needed for people working in the historic environment, and it's very similar to what Historic England requires for the lead professional on some of its grant funded projects. And again, that isn't really very well known, but Historic England did get involved in the writing of past 2035. They did consult on it, and so yeah, there are kind of mechanisms in place to make sure that it is workable in a historic environment. And again, I think that's a really important conversation to have with planning departments and conservation officers. So yeah, and I've said now there's lots of examples of past 2035 compliance in traditional buildings, where we put EWI and IWI on solid wall buildings, increasing loft insulation, even some cases of underfloor insulation, lots of examples of new windows. There are less in a heritage planning context, I would say, especially where the buildings that are protected are actually contributing to the area. But we are getting more and more and more. So here are some nice case studies just to end on. This is a locally listed building. It's a church that is no longer used as a church, and it has been converted into a like a kind of holiday let. It's on the northeast coast, and the church was retrofitted to InnoFit standard, which is the passive house standard for retrofit, which means it has really high levels of airtightness and really high, really low space heat demand. And what this case study shows is that technically it's possible, from a technical point of view, it's possible to make a solid wall building really, really, really energy efficient. And I don't think that argument is, I don't think that's in doubt anymore. I think that's, that's been proven. What is more difficult is how you can do that when being very, very careful about what's significant about the building. So if that building was nationally listed or in a conservation area, it probably would have been difficult to get PV on that elevation. Because yeah, there's a lot more flexibility there in discerning what is significant. But again, we are starting to see change, and some of the nicest change, some of the biggest innovations, I would say, are coming out of the areas with the highest number of listed buildings and conservation areas. I think simply because they have to. So Bath and North East Somerset Council, working in partnership with Bath and West Community Energy, gained some funding from the South West Net Zero Hub. I hope I'm representing this correctly. But it's a really impressive collaboration partnership project. and that allowed them to provide retrofit and conservation advice. They developed a Green Heritage Homes project, which created 2 new planning services within the local authority. And the first was a service level 0 pre-application, which meant you could get a pre-application discussion and meeting with the conservation officer for the very minimal cost of the conservation officer's site visit. So that's why it's called level 0, because it has a very basic cost and it's only available to those people with that exact problem, energy efficiency in a listed building, or it might be a conservation area building. And that means they get some very hands-on advice, and it really encourages people to kind of make the move, make the call to the planning department and say, can we think about this? And then the other service they provided was called the Listed Building Energy Champion Service. And what they've done is commissioned a modeller, an energy modelling company called People Powered Retrofit, and they now use their modelling software, Bath and Community Energy do. And so when somebody agrees to become an energy champion, the conservation officer and the energy assessor will visit the household together, and they'll have that joined up conversation about what the significance is and what the capacity for change is, and therefore what the measures could be. So rather than going, okay, that's significant, okay, well, I might be able to do that, oh no, that's going to harm that significance, they have the conversation in one sort of umbrella. And that's led to some positive changes in the local area. And certainly some of the householders that have engaged with the new service have been surprised about the level of changes that they can make. And I'd really encourage you to have a look at our case study on that. And then this is another case study from Bath that came to me through one of these conversations, actually. Live West is a major housing association in the southwest, and they have groups of listed buildings, particularly in Bath. This is a grade 1 listed building right in the middle of the World Heritage Site in the conservation area. And they recently, well, no, probably a year ago now, they got permission to install secondary glazing into a large number of those windows, actually, and a larger number than they thought would be possible when they first started having the conversation. So it's an illustration of how, doing the work that Bath and North East Up Somerset have done around kind of developing these services is leading to really positive decisions around this subject in the local area. And we have a case study on that as well. This is quite old now, but a reflection on the Port Sunlight Local Listed Building Consent Order, which gives planning permission, it gives listed building consent for double glazing in certain circumstances in Port Sunlight. I will move on from that because I'm really mindful of time. This is another one that came to me from one of these conversations. So Broxtowe Borough Council is a small local authority area in Nottinghamshire. They manage a series of old miners' cottages that are now housing association properties, and they wanted to install insulation under SHDF 2.1, I think. And their original idea was to do IWI, but they realised that wasn't technically possible. It was going to make the properties too small. But they also felt that the risk of having damp and mould would be increased by IWI because there would just be more thermal bridging. So they worked to get planning permission for EWI. They didn't think it was going to be possible. The person that was doing the heritage advice didn't work for Broxtowe Council. They were sort of like an external contractor, I think, and they wrote a report that said it would harm the significance of the buildings. But the planning, when it went to planning committee, the housing department stood up and gave a really kind of impressive speech about why, about in support of the EWI, really. And the councillors, the local authority members, voted in favour of the EWI. And in the committee report, I would encourage people to look at the case study here, and at the end you'll see it's linked to the committee report. And in that report, it cites a series of previous applications for wall insulation in a heritage context, and you'll see that if there is a refusal, it's normally for quite a specific reason. And then moving on to York, then York, I think we end on York, but I used to live in York, and around, I think probably about 15 years ago now, this building, which is outside the city centre, it's that little red dot on the top left hand of the map, and the pale yellow is like the city centre and the conservation area and everything. So it's outside the city centre. This building, the owners put solar panels, solar PV on the main house and some of the side buildings, the ancillary buildings, and the local authority actually threatened enforcement action to remove the panels from the main building, which the householder did. And that was 15 years ago now. And now we're in a situation where this building, the refectory opposite York Minster, has just been granted, about 2 years ago now, was granted permission for solar panels. And a lot of that work is down to the neighbourhood plan, which has been created by the chapter of York for a very defined area in the city centre. They did a lot of consultation creating the neighbourhood plan. Again, that was the provision for that is created under the Localism Act. And in that, they said that one of their main ambitions for the neighbourhood plan was to make the Minster as sustainable from an energy and business perspective as possible as it could be. And they said that harm would be needed, harm to significance would be needed, but that harm was acceptable on the basis of 4 reasons. And they were all, or a few reasons, I can't remember how many, but they were all around making the Minster more sustainable. And that neighbourhood plan became policy when it was adopted by the City Council, and it has formed the basis now for lots and lots of positive decisions around energy efficiency measures in heritage that previously kind of would have been unthinkable, I would argue. So yeah, and I think that's my final slide. Yeah, and then there's just some bits on useful resources. So have a look at the appeals database. There's always interesting case studies on there. And then there's some links to those local listed building consent orders and stuff like that. And another case study on social housing retrofit in a conservation area, this time Letchworth. Thank you, Toju.
Thanks, Sophie. That was a very good, insightful session.